I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's November 25th, and we have a lot to talk about. We're 2 days away from Thanksgiving in the United States, and as difficult as this year has been for so many people, I can still find things to be thankful for. I'm thankful for the researchers who continue their work in the most difficult anti-science environment we've ever experienced in this country. I'm thankful for those state and federal legislators who refuse to give up on healthcare in the most anti-healthcare political environment we've ever seen. I'm thankful for how, in the face of these particular challenges, the National MS Society has stepped up its advocacy efforts while investing over $30 million in support of more than 200 new and ongoing MS research studies around the world, including support and leadership for the International Progressive MS Alliance, an organization I'm truly thankful for. I'm thankful for the energy and passion for the mission that Kate Norton brings as the new executive director of my chapter of the MS Society, the Southern California chapter. I'm thankful for the Strum Whisperer, Laura Pemberton, and all my friends at the MS Society whose efforts and support helped me make this podcast exactly what I envisioned it could be. I'm thankful for my colleague, Christine Werner-Ozug, for all the amazing work she does to keep me and this podcast on track. And most of all, I'm thankful that each one of you has made Real Talk MS part of your world. I've said this many times before, and I'll probably continue to say that without you, I'd just be sitting here talking to myself. Before we get into today's episode, I want to take a moment to talk to you about something important to all of us, but it's something we haven't talked about before. I want to talk to you about why you should kick off your holiday season by making a donation to the National MS Society. When people think of fundraising, sometimes they only hear the ask. But let's talk about where the money goes. The National MS Society is the largest private funder of MS research in the world. And given the current state of research funding from our federal government, that statement, that fact alone, may be more important than ever before. We can't afford to lose the gains that research has delivered, the incredible momentum in scientific discovery that has brought us to this moment. We can't settle for standing still or going backwards when it comes to developing better therapies and working toward a cure. The Society not only funds research, they fund fellowships for future MS specialists. These are the experts who are going to discover that next generation of treatments that could lead to a cure. Without fundraising, there's no advocacy. As we celebrate Thanksgiving this week, we're also acknowledging the loss of the multi-million-dollar MS research program at the Department of Defense, the rolling back of federal guidelines that held airlines responsible for damage to wheelchairs, and the expiration of enhanced premium tax credits that made health insurance affordable and attainable for millions of Americans. For reasons we are all painfully aware of, advocacy has never been more important. Sometimes when people think of making a donation, they think of writing a big check. Well, if you find yourself in that kind of financial position, please go ahead and write a big check. But here's the thing about having strength in numbers. If everyone listening to this podcast episode donated just $5 to the National MS Society, we would raise over $80,000. And right now, during their matching campaign, that $80,000 would become $160,000, and that's difference-making money. So I hope you'll take 5 minutes right now and visit nationalmssociety.org/donate and help out with whatever amount you can. Many of you know what it means to live with MS every day. Now you can help change what it can look like tomorrow. If you're caring for a spouse, parent, or child who lives with MS, you've seen how MS affects a family. Today, you can be a difference maker by supporting the organization that supports you. And right now, there's that dollar for dollar match available, so whatever you can donate will actually go twice as far. That $5 donation becomes a $10 donation. I hope you'll join me in choosing to kick off this holiday season in what's been such a difficult year for so many people living with MS by donating what you can at nationalmssociety.org/donate, and you'll find that link in today's show notes. Most everyone with MS is aware of their sensitivity to heat, but cold weather presents a whole different set of challenges that we don't always think about. This week, I'm talking with Dr. James Stark about safely navigating cold weather-related conditions when you're living with MS. Dr. Stark is the Senior Attending Neurologist and Associate Medical Director at the International Multiple Sclerosis Management Practice, and he's here to share tips for staying safe when the temperature starts to drop. But before we get to my conversation with Dr. James Stark, there are a few other things that you should know about. Last week, the FDA gave final approval for a generic version of Vumerity for adults with relapsing forms of MS. The drug will be manufactured as a capsule by Zydus Life Sciences in India. Generic medications contain the same active ingredient as the brand name drug, and they must also match the brand name in terms of strength, dosage, and method of administration. Generics must also deliver the same amount of active ingredient into the bloodstream and demonstrate comparable safety and efficacy. The FDA had given tentative approval for this generic drug back in July of 2024, indicating that it met all quality, safety, and efficacy standards. But Zydus wasn't cleared to market the drug until the company had resolved a lawsuit over the treatment. With the lawsuit having been settled earlier this year, the FDA has given the green light to make this generic available. And I want to share a pro tip with you. The first place to check for generic medications should be Mark Cuban's Cost Plus Drug Company. You'll find them at costplusdrugs.com, and you'll find that link in today's show notes. While we're on the subject of lower-cost MS medications, last week, pharmaceutical company Sandoz announced the availability of Tyruko, the first biosimilar that's been approved for treating relapsing forms of MS. So I want to take a moment to share a quick explanation of what a biosimilar is. To understand biosimilars, you first have to understand what a biologic is. A biologic drug is a medicine that's made from a living organism, like yeast or bacteria or animal cells. And a biosimilar drug is a medicine that's also made from living organisms, but it has a different list of ingredients than the original biologic. And because biosimilars don't contain identical ingredients to the original drug, they require more testing. Now, you may be thinking to yourself that a biosimilar sounds a lot like a generic. They're actually more complex than generics, and they require a more extensive FDA approval process. Biosimilars are approved based on demonstrating that they are highly similar to an FDA-approved biologic drug, and they present no clinically meaningful differences in terms of safety and effectiveness compared to the FDA-approved biologic drug. Tyruko is a biosimilar for Tysabri, and like Tysabri, Tyruko will carry the same warnings about the risks associated with PML. If you'd like to learn more about generics and biosimilars for MS, I'll recommend that you check out my conversation with Dr. Jiwon Oh in episode 315 of Real Talk MS, and you'll find that link in today's show notes. There's no question that withholding federal research funding and often replacing real science with made-up science fiction have dealt a blow to scientific achievement in the United States. We haven't felt the brunt of it yet, but it's going to affect research for years to come. In spite of it all, the rate of scientific discovery is moving forward at a pace we've never witnessed before, and that's one of the reasons that attending an MS research conference can feel a little overwhelming. There's just so much to digest in a very short period of time. This past fall, I ran into Dr. Robert Fox at ECTRIMS, the largest MS research conference in the world. Now, if you're a regular listener, you know Dr. Fox is a friend of the podcast, and at ECTRIMS, he shared what amounted to a quick but comprehensive snapshot of the MS research landscape. In a moment, you'll hear our conversation. Dr. Robert Fox is a neurologist at the Cleveland Clinic's Mellon Center for Multiple Sclerosis Treatment and Research, as well as the Vice Chair of Research at the Cleveland Clinic Neurological Institute. Dr. Fox is also a professor of neurology at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine. He chairs the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee, and Dr. Fox serves as the managing director of the NARCOMS Patient Registry. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, John. Thanks for having me.
As I introduced you, our viewers heard just some of the many hats you wear. Those roles provide you with a somewhat unique vantage point over the entire MS research landscape. As you walk these halls and listen to the presentations here at ECTRIMS, what's the dominant theme or biggest buzz you're sensing this year? Is there a particular area, a new drug class, a diagnostic tool, or basic science concept that has clearly made a significant leap since we last gathered?
Well, what to me strikes me and jumps out is the balance of the risk and benefit of highly effective relapsing MS therapies. And we know that our highly effective therapies are very effective, but we also know that continuing many of them for the long term can have increased risk. I just came from a session where we learned from several different investigators about the longer people are on these drugs, the higher the risks of infections and other complications develop. And so what we're coming to realize is highly effective therapies are effective and are useful in at least some patients, but there is an ongoing risk-benefit trade-off, and it's not static. It is ongoing as patients continue through the disease, as they get older, as they are on these therapies longer, that risk-benefit trade-off may shift and may change.
There's been a major focus on tackling progression independent of relapse activity. Last year at ECTRIMS, you presented encouraging results of a phase 3 clinical trial for one of these BTK inhibitors, tolebrutinib, and non-relapsing secondary progressive MS. And we expect to hear whether that medication will receive FDA approval in late December. How might these drugs, which target the innate immune system within the brain and spinal cord, fundamentally change our approach to treating not just relapses, but this underlying chronic progression that's proven so difficult to understand, let alone stop?
Well, we are very effective at treating the relapsing component that comes from the immune system circulating around our body. We know that within the brain, there are processes that are leading and driving the gradual little by little progression in our patients, so-called progressive MS. Now, we don't know exactly what that pathology is, and indeed it may be a mixture of things, and that mixture may be different in different patients. But what we have learned is that the brain-penetrant BTK inhibitor tolebrutinib can slow down that progression of disability. Now, it's 31%. It's not 100%, but that's 31% more than we have already. And again, there's probably a mixture of mechanisms and pathologies that are driving progression. So I doubt we'll find any one therapy that stops progression like we found with relapsing MS. We do find therapies that are very, very effective in stopping all the disease activity. I suspect we won't find that with progressive MS. That said, with tolebrutinib, one of the questions was what sort of patients are more responsive or less responsive? And so presented here was a subgroup analysis looking at the men and the women, older and younger patients, more disabled and less disabled patients, longer disease duration and shorter disease duration. And it turns out that although there was a little bit of variability in the point estimates of the efficacy of tolebrutinib in decreasing the risk of sustained progression of disability, it really didn't change much. there was a little bit of a signal that patients with gadolinium-enhancing lesions may be more responsive, which sounds like what we saw with some of the other therapies, that the more relapsing pathology you have, the more likely you'll respond to a therapy. But the big caveat there is although the GAD-positive patients seemed to be more likely to respond to tolebrutinib, it wasn't patients who had relapses. It wasn't the younger patients. It wasn't the patients with a lower disability. So that tells us that actually GAD is not indicating active inflammation in these patients, although it does indicate that. It's probably a marker for some other pathology that is driving progression. And I'll note that the patients without gadolinium-enhancing lesions still seem to have a benefit. It just wasn't as marked as those with gadolinium-enhancing lesions. So we are learning some how to treat progression, but there's still a lot for us to learn.
For years, clinicians have relied on MRIs and relapses to guide treatment. Now we're seeing an explosion of research into fluid biomarkers like neurofilament light chain and glial fibrillary acidic protein. In your view, how close are we to using these blood tests in routine clinical practice to personalize treatment, monitor disease activity more precisely, and make earlier decisions when it comes to switching therapies?
Well, on the one hand, neurofilament light, or NFL, is a useful tool to identify patients with active inflammation. The big caveat, though, is that I haven't seen any data to show that that's any better than MRI. And indeed, we do know that some patients with MRI activity do not have an elevation in neurofilament. So neurofilament is a not as sensitive test. So it's a little easier because it's just a blood test. It's less expensive, but it's also much less sensitive in picking up disease activity. So I envision neurofilament filling in the gaps between MRIs, but not replacing MRIs and monitoring for the relapsing disease pathology. Now, we've also come to learn that neurofilament does not reflect the progressive component of MS. We had hoped it would, but it turns out it doesn't reflect progressive MS. So neurofilament may be helpful in the filling in the gaps in between brain MRIs. Now, the GFAP that you referred to, that was thought to be a very exciting molecule because elevated levels of GFAP are predictive of future disability. So the hope was that we could also use that as a treatment response biomarker. Unfortunately, what we found is that it doesn't change with treatment. It doesn't change with any of our currently approved MS therapies. And so it's still true that high levels of GFAP predict future disability, but it's not actionable because it doesn't mean, therefore, we should do this therapy versus that therapy. And we can't follow it over time. I mean, we can measure it over time, but it's not useful because it doesn't seem to shift with our therapies.
There's a significant amount of research focused on nervous system repair, remyelination, and neuroprotection. Based on the science being presented here, what do you see as the most viable strategies on the horizon for actually reversing damage and restoring function? And what's the biggest barrier we still need to overcome to make that a reality?
So the two things that I am seeing, and it's old things that we keep relearning, not because we forget, but because they are so impactful and so profound. The one is the impact of physical exercise, of movement, of walking, of whatever the exercise that patients can do. That has a neuroprotective effect. And we're learning some about the mechanisms and how it has a neuroprotective effect. But we know that patients who exercise do better over time. Now, some of our patients say, hey, doc, I walk with a walker or a cane. I can't get on a treadmill. Okay, but there are some exercises you can do. There are arm bicycles that patients can do who still have arm function. There are ways patients can be active and we think are helpful. The other facet is learning about the comorbid conditions, the other medical things that are going on with patients and how that impacts the progression of MS. That includes smoking and diabetes and vascular disease like hypertension. And so we are revisiting and relearning the importance of treating these other things, which of course are beneficial not just for MS, but other aspects of health. So it's relearning some of the basic aspects of treat those medical conditions, stop smoking, and encourage patients to exercise. Now, to your question of why has it been hard to do? Well, it's hard to change human behavior. It's hard to get people who haven't exercised to start exercising. A smoking cessation is really hard in people who have a smoking addiction, but it doesn't mean that these are not worthy exercises, worthy efforts for us to attempt.
Finally, looking at the sheer volume and quality of the science presented here at ECTRIMS, what excites you the most? For someone who's listening to our conversation, someone who may have been recently diagnosed with MS, what's the most important message coming out of this conference that you'd like to share with them?
Well, there is a tremendous amount of research being done, and so I think there is great hope in the future. What I'm also encouraged about, and I was reflecting over the last 2 days, is the new faces that I see giving talks that are presenting research. It used to be the same old dogs, and I'm one of them, that would be up there presenting over and over again. But there are a new crop of researchers, new generation of people who are attracted to the field of MS because there is so much we can do. There is so much we can learn. And I would encourage people with MS to look around for ways to get involved in research. Clinical trials, but much beyond clinical trials. There are registries, there are biorepositories where your blood or brain MRIs can be part of longitudinal studies. It's only by studying MS that we can figure out how to treat MS better.
To your point, someone listening to this conversation who wants to take the doctor's advice can visit the NARCOM's website, for instance, where they can register and take part in the surveys you put out, because the information that comes from those surveys, it serves everyone living with MS.
Yeah, so NARCOMS is a patient registry. Anyone can go to the website, narcoms.org, and sign up and take a survey twice a year to share with us about their journey with MS and understand their therapies, their different diseases, the symptoms that come up, and they can participate from the comfort of their own home.
Well, wearing all the hats you wear, I want to thank you for doing that, for doing all you do to improve the lives of people living with MS, people affected by MS. Thanks so much for making time to talk with me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for sharing the story of MS with the world. It's good to be with you.
In one of his many roles, Dr. Fox chairs the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee. And last week, the Alliance hosted a global webcast entitled Hidden Potential: How Existing Drugs Could Transform MS Treatment. Repurposing a drug that's already been approved by the FDA means that the drug has already demonstrated that it's safe for people. That shortens a clinical trial. And if that trial produces a positive outcome, that medication gets to people faster. If you missed last week's webcast, you can catch the video replay, and you'll find that link in today's show notes. I live in Los Angeles, and last week the temperature dipped into the mid-60s, which for us is winter weather. Now, winter weather in many other parts of the country isn't nearly as nice or forgiving, and that cold weather can create a whole set of challenges for someone living with MS. Dr. James Stark joins me in a moment with tips for beating those cold weather-related conditions. Heat sensitivity is a familiar occurrence for people living with MS. But as we head into the cold weather months, it's important to remember that winter can also be challenging. Frigid temperatures, ice, snow, and less daylight can all have an impact on someone with MS. Dr. James Stark is joining me today to share practical tips for managing winter's weather-related challenges. Dr. Stark is the Senior Attending Neurologist and Associate Medical Director. He's the Director of Clinical Trials and the Fellowship Director at the International Multiple Sclerosis Management Practice. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Stark.
Oh, well, thanks very much, John. Thanks for having me.
As I mentioned a moment ago, It may be more common for people with MS to be affected by heat, but many people also experience a change in their symptoms when it gets cold. What are some cold weather related changes that affect people with MS?
Yeah, you're right. So the heat sensitivity, or what's called Uthoff's phenomenon, is very well known in MS because heat makes nerves conduct electricity a little slower. And of course, that's the problem in multiple sclerosis, is conducting electricity to the nerves. So that's a very common symptom. Not everybody has that, but those that do, it can be difficult in the warmer months. But I do hear a number of patients complain about the opposite, about cold affecting their multiple sclerosis. And when I hear it from patients, I hear it more that the cold can affect their muscles, especially muscle stiffness in MS that we call spasticity. And so in general, spasticity is basically stiffening of the muscles, and it is worse after periods of inactivity, like first thing in the morning or after sitting in an MRI machine for an hour. And there are medications for it, but the best thing to do for that, firstly, is really just stretching and sort of doing physical things to help kind of get the body going, because that tends to get better as the day goes on. So I do hear that the cold can affect muscle stiffness, but there's also a host of other things that winter is going to bring us that may be more difficult with MS patients. Just the weather in general, the icy conditions, snow. If you have any issues with mobility or balance, you need to take extra care when dealing with the elements. Along the lines of the heat sensitivity as well, you may overdo it with trying to battle the cold with too many layers of clothing and heating devices and things like that. So you basically want to try to layer your clothes and try to think about the change from inside and outside, especially if you're traveling around. So again, layered clothing is a good idea, as well as all of the, hats and thick socks and gloves and scarves and all those kinds of things as well. There's a host of other things as well. There's the seasonal infections that are more common in the wintertime. So it's flu season coming up. COVID's really been around the whole time, but also does tend to get a little worse in the winter. For those two, we do recommend the seasonal vaccines. And unless you've had COVID or something within the last few months, then you certainly don't need it. And in general, if you are ill, you want to do the things that you're supposed to be doing, like hydrating well and resting and trying to avoid sick contacts if possible. So I never wore a mask before COVID, but I still have one with me because I take the subway every day. And if I'm on the subway and someone's next to me coughing, I'm going to throw that mask on. So there is still a time and place for these things, especially our patients that are often on immunomodifying medications. Most of our current treatments are certainly not as immunosuppressive as our old treatments used to be. So I try not to have patients, live in fear of it, because we're exposed to viruses all the time, and that's actually good for us in some ways. But I think, a common sense approach is reasonable in those situations, again, especially on the New York City subways.
I think that rule can even be expanded beyond the subways, especially as we head into the holiday season, when there are family gatherings, holiday parties. They're all indoors, and they usually involve a lot more people than you may be in contact with on a day-to-day basis. And some of those parties can be pretty close quarters, depending upon how many people are jammed into that home or that room, in fact, or even the office. So I think everything you just said not only works on a subway, but works for a lot of holiday celebrations where people are going to be among many others that they may not see on a daily basis.
That's absolutely true. And again, if you're not feeling well, you may need to skip this event. And it is okay still these days to wear a mask or try to distance a little bit. But I also want to encourage people not to avoid, these events that they would otherwise want to go to out of, say, fear of contracting something. I think you just have to have a reasonable approach to it.
During the winter, we experience less sunlight. And sunlight is the primary source of vitamin D. Will someone with MS benefit from taking a vitamin D supplement during the winter?
Absolutely. So vitamin D is really the only vitamin that is clearly been associated in clinical trials, as opposed to some of our basic research, with benefit in multiple sclerosis. So vitamin D is interesting because, around where I am, we're basically low most of the year. We only make vitamin D from late April to mid September, and then we live off of it all winter. You get vitamin D from the UV rays. So even if it's a bright sunny day, if I'm laying out in the sun in the middle of February, I'm not getting a tan, and that's what basically is giving you the vitamin D. So I actually have most of my patients on vitamin D all year round, and higher doses in the wintertime. And that's a pretty easy thing to check in blood work. And we're really looking for a mid-range around 50 of your vitamin D level. There's really no evidence that very, very high levels help anymore. So yes, I think the vitamin D should be increased in the winter. And that, again, is an easy blood work to sort of check where you are. And then there are other roles of sunlight and the UV rays that we don't fully understand. For example, seasonal affective disorder. Some people, many people in general, in the winter can feel down. And there are many reasons about that in terms of maybe the holidays. Some people don't react well to the holidays and things. But we have used UV lights to help treat seasonal affective disorder. And I think that it has been somewhat effective. So I think thinking about mood and just seasonal depression is something else to keep in mind around winter and the holidays.
Well, to your point there, people tend to stay indoors more during the winter months, and that can sometimes lead to feelings of loneliness and isolation, can certainly contribute to the changes in mood you just referenced. Any suggestions for how someone can offset those feelings when it's cold and gloomy outside?
Sure. So yeah, we all are indoors much more in the winter, and our patients, especially those with disability, may find it, unsafe to really leave the house, all that often, especially without assistance. So I think in those circumstances, really making use of the technology that we have today, and we were all isolated during the pandemic, and it definitely, affected my psychological well-being. So we would schedule, Zoom meetings. I had them every Sunday with my family in England, and we would do trivias. And so each week, a different family member would sort of take over, the trivia questions, and that was something to look forward to. We did that, I think, with friends as well, and use again the Zoom technologies that we've sort of all become much better at, forced to become much better at, given the pandemic.
Well, I'm hoping you can share some additional tips for how people with MS can best prepare for and manage winter's weather-related challenges.
Sure. So, there are a variety of workarounds that really can be done to sort of manage the effects of winter. So, for example, you may need to adjust your schedule if you're an evening person, but by 4:30 here it's dark out already. You might need to adjust when you're doing your activities, especially shopping and things like that. You need to take a little more time. Again, in the morning, if you are more stiff, or in the cold weather, you just sort of take some more time to stretch and sort of warm up. You would want to address heat sensitivity with people, especially if you're staying with family members over the holidays. If you are heat sensitive and they have the thermostat up to 80, you need to let them know that is something and why it's uncomfortable for you, and not sort of just complain about it. And you can also, again, layer your clothes so that you can find the right temperature for you. I would say there's a few little things, like if you are going to use something like a portable heater or an electric blanket, those can be, very useful devices. You need to be a little careful about those sorts of things. You wouldn't want to have that on and fall asleep and get a burn or something like that, especially if you have already some sensory issues like numbness. Yeah, and I think just maintaining safety outside. If you are in a slippery environment, you need to have good tread in your shoes. If there is snow outside your home, you might need to have somebody come and help you navigate that. Yeah, I think now the important thing to remember when we talk about these things that affect MS is generally they're not actually stimulating the immune system to cause new damage to the brain and spinal cord. Generally, it is sort of just a reminder of the problems that you've had in the past that can get a little worse and then a little bit better when you're indoors. So those are things that are can make MS different on a day-to-day basis for people, but that aren't necessarily making the disease worse.
Well, Dr. James Stark, I want to thank you for all you do to improve the lives of people living with MS. And thanks so much for putting together a neat little toolkit for navigating winter. Thanks for talking with me today.
Oh, thank you very much.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/430. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. Imagine adding the responsibilities of being a caregiver to the pressures and challenges that go along with being a teenager. Next week, you'll meet Michaela Jansen-Pohl. Michaela became a caregiver for her mother who lives with MS while she was still in high school. I hope you'll join me next week on Real Talk MS. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.